What is up, everybody? Welcome to the first ever 4for4mula1 podcast. If you've been following 4for4, you know we specialize in fantasy football, but DraftKings just released Formula One on their platform. So we got into it. It's a new sport, and I think it'll be really fun. We'll get into some of the specifics really quick for you that don't know me. I'm TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. With my co-host today, Dan Weiner. Dan is the senior producer at BetSperts. BetSperts is the parent company of 4for4. Dan, introduce yourself a little bit. How you doing?
I'm good, man. This is fun. Yeah, I've been at BetSperts for almost a year now, and I came on as a producer, behind the scenes mostly, the deep dive, brown bag bets, any of the shows that you see there. If you follow our social media, any of the graphics that you see us put up, I'm usually in charge of that. If you've watched the deep dive or any of our programming over there, you probably heard them refer to producer Dan. That's me. I'm just a Formula One fan for the last few years. I'm like most Americans. I started watching Drive to Survive during the pandemic. And super got into Formula One for the last couple of years, and I've just kind of grown and grown and grown. And TJ dropped just in one of our Slack channels at work that DraftKings has Formula One now, and that kind of morphed into an extremely intense DFS conversation between a few of us. And last night it was like, why don't we just do a show? And here we are today.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, my background in Formula One is very limited, obviously, just like you. Like probably most American fans got into it because of the Netflix series, started watching it a lot last year. Unfortunately, being in California, we don't have any California-facing legal betting right now. So I wasn't able to put money on it last year. When DraftKings launched their product, it seems like, one, it's just a great opportunity because it's a brand new sport. Anytime there's a brand new sport, there's going to be no projections or bad projections, no tools. So it's the reason I've always been really hesitant to get into other sports besides football is because, one, everybody's just any sport that's popular, everybody's already good at. It's a huge learning curve. With this, it's brand new. Most people don't even follow F1 yet in the United States, even though, Drive to Survive is so popular. And then our small group at 4for4 and BetSperts, like you said, we just got really into it. We started, kind of planning whatever strategy we could. We only had about a week turnover time after the game launched. And then by Sunday, it seemed like obviously it's new, but relative to the crowd, had a pretty good grasp on what's going on. So we figured, why not get out ahead of this thing? And, let's see if some people are interested. So, I mean, besides F1 and the Netflix, do you have any other background with betting, DFS, racing at all, NASCAR or anything like that?
Just as a fan.
Cool.
I've watched NASCAR, believe it or not. So I grew up in the South. I grew up in Atlanta, but I didn't start watching NASCAR until I moved to Connecticut. And watched the Daytona 500 one year with a buddy who was super into NASCAR. And so I followed NASCAR off and on. And then Formula One probably came to the States. ESPN got it probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and it just kind of grew. And one of the funny things is like my sport's college football. That's what I do mostly if I'm doing betting, all that kind of stuff. And college football Twitter is super into Formula One right now, largely because it happens on Sunday. Sure. And you see some people who cross over between college and the NFL, but like not everyone. So if those races bleed into the start of NFL coverage, you have college football Twitter doesn't really care all that much. Sure. So that's kind of where it came from. But I mean, college football is probably what I would say is where my expertise is when it comes to betting. And it's just kind of been a fan of motor racing for a few years. And now that Formula One's here and pretty simple, like NASCAR. I like NASCAR, but sometimes those races are just super long and not a whole lot will happen. This year's been a little different, but Formula One, it's like a couple hours, you're in and out. It's pretty great.
Yeah, I mean, the NASCAR has actually been one of the, more popular niche is kind of an oxymoron, but one of the niche sports that has a pretty good DFS following. I don't know anything about it. From my very brief understanding is that, at least on DraftKings, the scoring systems are very different. That even if people have played NASCAR, I think hopping into F1, everybody's kind of starting completely from scratch. I mean, as somebody that obviously it's only been one day we've ever had F1 DFS, but there's been betting. But like, what would you tell somebody that has never watched F1 and that's thinking about getting into either DFS or betting? Like, what are the advantages or reasons you like it as a betting game?
I to me, it's the simplicity
Hmm.
of it. I wish that the books offered more.
Yeah.
I don't do I don't do offshore betting. Like
Yeah.
I'm in,
Yeah.
like I said, I'm in Connecticut. We got legal betting this
Yeah.
fall. It just kind of was a thing where I
Yeah.
started doing it this fall once we got it legally, and then I work with a lot of guys who are super into betting, and so I'm kind of into gambling more theoretically than I am in
Sure.
practice. Like I bet on sports, but like I'm the kind of guy who's like, oh, I'm super into the golf betting that we're doing right now because
Yep.
big long shots. If you hit one, it feels good, whatever. But it's just the simplicity of it. Like you said,
Yes.
it's a one time event. You're not having to grind every day on lineups and pitching matchups and
Yep.
NBA guys. This guy's out this week. This guy's not. It's kind of like golf and it's kind of like football in that essence too. I think in that it's you have to keep your eye on certain things,
Hmm.
but you have one matchup. We have like coming up this week. We have Saudi Arabia, and we can dig in on Saudi Arabia and we can pay attention to what's going on. But we can probably spend a full day
Hmm.
researching the track, who did well here last year. I mean, when we get to the preview show later in the week, the kind of the differences and whatever, but you kind of can just grind on it and it's just one event and you move on.
Yep.
And then there's like a lot of quick betting, like first lap leader, these kinds of things. I wish some of the offshore books do matchups,
Yeah.
more driver matchups. I think the only one yesterday that I found on DraftKings was like either the Williams or the Aston
Yeah.
Martin drivers. Like it wasn't a great matchup.
Yeah.
They did groups of
Yes.
drivers.
Yeah.
Like I kind of wish I had screenshotted and gone back and seen where there would have been value in that.
Yeah. I mean, there's some interesting. We'll get into this a little bit more when we get down to the betting portion. I mean, even though I can't bet on it, I definitely browse what's available. There's some interesting props, like number of drivers that will finish the race. I think things like that. There's probably a small edge in those, and even though early on these books might not offer a ton of games, and DFS too, there was only there was only a couple tournaments with a prize pool even above $10,000. But that's kind of a good thing. One, because those smaller prize pools are going to keep a lot of the sharks away, at least for now. And when there isn't a lot of betting lines offered, that generally means that the books aren't paying super close attention to the sport, which means there's probably going to be some really exploitable lines in the sport, which is a good thing. And that's kind of why I'm very interested, because we got a brand new game, even though it's been around betting, still pretty small, brand new DFS, which is usually a bigger edge. Nobody really has, there's a couple sites that already have projections and tools up for it, but they're just going to be bad. And I don't even know if there's really, if you're not building 150 lineups in DFS, I don't know if you should even really be using a bad projection system at this point. I think you could learn the game without a tool, which for every other sport is almost impossible. Like you said, it's a really fun and quick sweat. The race started at 8 a.m. Pacific time. It's over by 9:45. You still have your whole day. You're not sitting there. Even football and golf, I mean, it's fun, but it's an all-day commitment. You don't have your results till the end of the day. And I actually do think that as popular as F1 is getting in the U.S., I do think it will, the time constrictions, because of how early a lot of races starts, will keep a fair amount of people out, just because some people aren't going to get up at 4:30 a.m. to watch a race that starts at 5 on the West Coast. But the counter to that, and why I like this again, is we can't really build lineups in DFS until qualifying is over, because that's when we have all the information. So you really only have an 18-hour period to build lineups. But unlike NFL, even golf sometimes to an extreme point, basketball, there isn't going to be injury news. There's not going to be a lot that changes from the end of qualifying to morning. So if you want to make lineup Saturday night, sleep in, watch the recorder race, for the most part, you're probably going to be okay, which you can't really say with any other sport. There will be things that come up. If somebody has a gearbox issue during qualifying, you'll have to keep an eye on that. But you could probably get away with being a little lazy on the day of, which can kind of counter that worry about those early races. It's just a really small time investment. There's always only going to be 20 drivers and 10 constructor teams. The player pool is super small. Football, the player pool it feels infinite. Every other sport, golf, even 60, 70 golfers to choose from. That's tough. There's 30 options to pick from. 20 drivers, 10 constructor, and if one driver's out, it's just that much smaller. A lot of the sharp players are grinding things like golf right now. it's like almost a perfect bridge between football season. F1 is, started last week, goes through November. So yeah, there's lots of fun reasons to join. Even if you haven't watched F1, or just getting into like, what are some like really basic things that we know about F1 in your opinion that are, that can help you like, build somewhat intelligently?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that you have to think about first and foremost is there's a very clear hierarchy of who's good and who's not.
Yeah.
With the caveat being some of it seems to have flipped so far just through one race right now, but generally speaking, you know that Red Bull and Mercedes are going to be good. Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton are going to be good.
Right.
We'll get deeper into it when we get into this race. It looks now like Ferrari is possibly regaining their mantle as the team to beat in Formula One. But, Ferrari and McLaren the last couple of years were a step down from them. So it's pretty easy to tier out over the course of the year who's good, who's not. And, we'll see how the pricing ends up going when it comes to DFS. It wasn't great. Like they clearly weren't on top of everything this week. And it's going to be interesting to see how they adjust now that they have a race full of data to kind of make some of the adjustments that they're going to need to the prices to make you have to make some difficult decisions with your lineups. But I think the thing that you can kind of launch into is, that there are going to be teams who are good and there are going to be teams who are not. You're probably not going to want to rely on a Williams driver.
Yeah.
Right now, Aston Martin and McLaren are kind of a mess. Now, McLaren we've seen do well in the past few years, so maybe they'll get better. You also kind of have to pay attention that sometimes the cars will get better. The teams get more data on their own car and will improve them over time. Mercedes' car isn't going to be clearly the third best team all season. They are going to challenge the other two teams.
Yep.
I mean, as an American, I'd like to see Haas do well. I don't think you're going to see Haas perform at the level they performed this week all year. So you can kind of tier it out in that regard. And the data kind of gets pretty easy. You have 3 practice sessions. You have 2 practice sessions on Friday. You have a practice session on Saturday morning and then 3 qualifying sessions on Saturday. The data is readily available. You can go get it on the Formula One website. You can find people who are out there doing lap by lap information out there. So it's easily available data. And I think you kind of have a good sense of, it's not like football where there's going to be a week where some running back you're not expecting is just going to have a great week.
Yeah.
Or, some quarterback X just so happened to torch a really good defense, or Patrick Mahomes happened to have a really bad week against a bad defense.
Yeah.
Unless there's rain in Formula One, as the season progresses, the tier kind of establishes itself, and that kind of gives you something to work off of.
Yeah, for people that aren't familiar with Formula One, this is extra exciting that DraftKings launched this year for people that want to get into a new sport for gambling or daily fantasy, because they did a massive overhaul to their cars this year. Every car is basically rebuilt from scratch. They had they changed their modifications and what's allowed dramatically. The last time they did that was 2014. So really everybody is starting from scratch, and that's why this season is really exciting. But Formula One is a very top-heavy, money-driven sport. The teams that have the most money are typically going to be the best racing teams, and there's no cap to that. Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, they just have the most money, and there's nothing the other teams could do about it. And often the teams at the bottom, by the end of the year, they can't even afford to be in Formula One anymore. They have to merge. So we have a pretty good idea in general how that's going to play out. But with this new season, those bottom tier teams, those mid-level teams, there's probably going to be some shakeup over the first few races. And we get to experience that in real time with the new DFS sport. So that's why it's really exciting. And we'll get into it later. Like, just because those Williams, Aston Martin teams McLaren teams aren't doing well because of daily fantasy, and hopefully if they get some more like matchup type bets up, it gives us a reason to pay attention to those teams and those drivers, which is really exciting, because if you just watch the sport as a brand new fan, especially like last year, you might be like, it's Lewis and Max every time. What's the point of this? It really lets us watch driver 1 through driver 20, which is going to be really, really exciting. So we'll get into some DFS and betting specifics, but let's just talk some real world racing real quick. Again, neither of us say that we're F1 experts, but just from us talking over the last couple of weeks, you do have a pretty good pulse on what's going on in the practices. Who's been fast, really in practice all preseason. What stood out to you in this first real race? Practice qualifying, the race in general. Again, everything's brand new this year. So what popped to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you start with, for those who are brand new to this, the teams do 2 testing weekends before the first weekend of the race. So they go to Barcelona, they test their car on the track then they went to Bahrain, which is where the first race was. They do some testing there, and then you get to race weekend. Yep. And there's some gamesmanship is usually played. Like, not everything is created equal. Like, some teams, like, so Haas, for example, if you've been following the news at all, you might know that they lost their title sponsor, Uralkali, because of the connection to Russia. And their driver, Nikita Mazepin, his dad is a Russian oligarch. And so they cut ties with him. So they came out full speed ahead when they were able to get on the track and testing, whereas other teams, because they needed to maybe attract sponsors, whereas other teams kind of play it safe. They're working on some things. They're doing some different things. And Mercedes, the big story was Mercedes was really bad in testing. Mm-hmm. But Mercedes sandbags year in and year out. Like, it's a running joke in Formula One that, it's just Mercedes sandbagging. Yeah. So when we got to practice and testing and then the race itself, I think that's the biggest thing is, like, Mercedes is not sandbagging. Their car is not there yet. It's just not as fast. They have issues with some of the what they're calling the porpoising, where the suspension is bouncing up and down on the track, which causes them to lose speed. They're just not as fast as the top 2 groups. Talked about Haas. The way that car has looked so far has been spectacular. I mean, for them to get a P5 or finish in 5th place. If you're new to the sport, P and then the place, is how they refer to it.
Yeah, so we don't say 3rd place in
Formula
One.
They say P3. So P5, 5th place. Kevin Magnussen's a great result for them. Yeah. So that was interesting to see. And then Ferrari, again, we talk about, as a University of Texas graduate, we say Texas is back is the running joke. It looks like Ferrari is back, like from testing, from both sessions of testing to practice to qualifying to the race itself. They had probably a flawless couple of, it's about a month because testing starts at the beginning of March. It was basically flawless for them. And that's going to make everything that we're talking about way more interesting as we go forward, because you have now 3 teams that you're going to have to deal with and try to figure out, okay, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, are those teams going to be the teams that we have to figure out, okay, which one do we pick as a constructor? Which one do you pick as your captain? And the answer is going to be, you probably should sprinkle it and come up with lineups that mix and match that. But it will create a little bit more variance than it would in the past when you would just have the 2 dominant teams. Other than that, McLaren struggles. It was a mess for them. Daniel Ricciardo tested positive for COVID, and so he missed the Bahrain testing session and never really got up to speed, and yet still beat Lando Norris in the race, which was super surprising result there, I thought. And that's kind of where it is. Alfa Romeo. So the Ferrari engine struggled the last few years, but Ferrari, obviously, Alfa Romeo and Haas are all running that Ferrari engine and all had really great weekends. Alfa Romeo ended up getting points for both drivers. Valtteri Bottas had a terrible start to the race, but worked his way back. And then Zhou Guanyu, the first ever Chinese Formula One driver in his debut race, ends up getting points. And even Mick Schumacher, I think, finished 11th. Mick Schumacher finished 1 spot out of the points. Now, of course, there's the overarching Red Bull losing both drivers, but even if Joe finishes 12th and Schumacher 13th, those are encouraging results. So it's just kind of like the midfield might be flipped. And then the thing that I think is the funniest is just Alpine is just floating along there, the 5th best team. They're not nearly ever going to break into the top 4, but they're probably not going to be as bad as the rest. They're just there. But that was kind of what stood out to me.
Yeah, and for our purposes, especially DFS wise, I think those are going to be the really exciting teams for us. Those Alpine type teams where they're always going to be in the mix for points. Those are going to be some of our biggest decision points all year. I mean, you the joke about Lewis. I mean, even if you've watched races in the past, not even this year, even mid race, Lewis Hamilton's always complaining about his tires and then smokes the field or something.
Mhm.
So, yeah, we were even through practice, them being slow, we didn't know how real it was. Obviously they don't qualify in the top four, and in any DFS sport or fantasy sport, the film versus data bros will always have their arguments. Like the one thing about watching the races is if you did watch the race, sure, Lewis and George Russell finished 3-4. Red Bull doesn't finish the race, but what I think the takeaway was Mercedes was just not on the pace at all of the top two teams. And they made like a huge pit error at the beginning, putting Lewis on hard tires. He was the first one to pit. That proved to be an error, like really fast. It was an obvious error. So they're going to figure things out. I actually think it's probably for gamblers and for DFS players, probably going to be an edge if you get out ahead of when Mercedes gets it together. Like, you might get there early and miss, lose a couple of bucks on it. But if you're the first one on it, it's going to be very profitable when it hits. And I think eventually they will get there. McLaren being horrible was there was some precedent in the practices. They weren't pushing very well, but they were competing so much with Ferrari for that 3-4 spot in constructors last season that they were a team that had aspirations to be fighting for that again. They have a lot of work to do, and then the big thing that was supposed to happen this year with the remodel of the cars is overtaking supposed to be easier. We saw it with Leclerc and Verstappen up front. They had some great battles going on for quite a few laps. And then we saw quite a few drivers move up a lot of grid spots. Obviously, three drivers have to retire their cars. But Bottas has that horrible started from 6, gets all the way back to 6. We saw his teammate. I think he moved up five grid spots, 6 grid spots. We saw Yuki Tsunoda. He moved up, I believe, 6 grid spots. I think Schumacher even moved up 4 or 5 grid spots. So we are seeing racers can start bad and finish decent, which we just didn't see last year. And that's kind of why we call this like a lower variant sport. If it's a track that isn't going to have a lot of crashes or there isn't weather, just in the past we've seen if you get off that starting grid good and you don't make pit errors, it's going to be hard to catch this. Hopefully we will see some more overtaking this year. But yeah, it's exciting. Let's get into the exciting stuff. We're not going to have this full breakdown every week, but we wanted to give you guys some background on what's going on since it's the first one. Let's get into the DFS recap. Before we get into it, if you don't mind throwing up just a screenshot of the points breakdown, and you can't see it here; it's pretty small, but basically 25 points to first place in the constructors and the driver scoring, tiers down to 10th place. And then there's a couple other small points for laps led, which teammate is going to win, which is something we'll get into a lot, and then improving or losing grid position. So correct me if I'm wrong, but really what we're going to be looking at a lot, and why I think nuanced projection models, at least early on, or at least this season, probably aren't going to really grasp a ton, is because we're going to be able to look at the teams that are good, look at the grid positions, and should pretty easily be able to project where they land on this scoring scale. Do you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, I think you can kind of figure, okay, well, the top 2 teams, like right now, going into Saudi Arabia, you would have to assume that Red Bull and Ferrari are still fighting out for those top 4 spots. So, okay, you can kind of figure out what's going to happen there. I don't know if the laps led, it's like a 10th of a point per lap led.
Right.
I don't know how much that's going to be a boost to anybody unless you end up with a situation where one driver just leads the whole race and they get 5 or more points for that. And then you can kind of figure, but a lot of it too, it's going to be kind of hard to figure. Like, you can't really project if a driver is going to, unless someone unless a car that you're not expecting to be very good qualifies well, like maybe there's a fade there that they might not
that makes sense.
do well and then fall down the pecking order. But yeah, I think to let everyone in on the group chat, and it's, I think it may be a jumping off point is, a lot of the discussion was over, okay, is it the +5 for beating your own teammate, or is it trying to figure out what where a driver is going to finish in the standings, like what is the appropriate way to attack that. And at least in my opinion, until the Red Bull cars crapped out at the end of the race, it really did seem like stacking constructor
Yeah.
and captain and then trying to find those what appeared to be pretty dead set, this guy is going to beat his teammate,
Yes.
seemed to be the way to go until it wasn't. But, when you get to a track like Saudi Arabia coming up this weekend, or where there's races where you might have variance, maybe it's not the right strategy.
Yeah, I mean, so let's actually get into that, because we were going again completely from scratch. So let's kind of cover what we thought was going to work, and then we'll look back at what definitely did work. So the 25 points for a win, when you look at the tier of scoring all the way down, like it's not a huge number over the field when, what is it, 20 then down to 18 for third, I think. Like you can, if a driver beats his teammate and he gets 5 points, that's 20% of the winning score. That's like relatively a lot of points. So we were kind of trying to figure out, how are you going to maximize your ceiling on a lineup. For those that don't know, we should clarify. The DFS lineup is one captain position where you get 1.5 times your points, and it's 1.5 times the salary. 4 driver positions and 1 constructor. So you have 5 drivers and 1 constructor, 1 team in your lineup, and obviously have to fit under the $50,000 DraftKings cap. But that ability to, the reason we thought it would be optimal to stack your captain with your constructor is because if they win, which you're chasing with your captain, your biggest ceiling is going to come from getting the winning points. A lot of times that winner is going to get some laps led points. He's going to get his team beating his teammate 5 more points, multiply that times 1.5. And if you pay for a good constructor and both teammates finish high, your point multiplier, the upside of that, is just astronomical. You're just not going to be able to get that, even though you'll save salary, like paying for a Haas in your captain spot or your constructor spot. The upside with points just isn't going to be there. So I think early on it was pretty clear to us that we wanted to be stacking those two for maximum upside. There were some salary constraints where, like, I had some lineups where I played Leclerc in my captain, Max as my driver, and I couldn't afford, or opposite actually, like Max is my captain, Leclerc is my driver, and couldn't afford the Red Bull constructor, but you still throw in your Ferrari constructor. One thing we did talk about is not stacking 2 drivers together. Now, you can't stack 2 drivers with your constructor, but you can play teammates. And the reason we said we didn't want to do that is because you get 5 points for beating your teammate. That's a lot of points in this format. So if you're playing, say, 2 cheap guys and their teammates, you just have no upside with them unless somehow they both finish top 10, which if they're starting the back of the grid or they're cheap is almost impossible. You want those 5 points. And that's why we thought it wouldn't be a good idea to play teammates together. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was my thinking the whole way through was, and the other thing is, and it ended up being the case, and we're not going to see this going forward because they'll adjust the prices. It ended up working out that there were some, assuming that the Red Bull was going to not lose. Like they didn't quite have the projections right, which is totally understandable. It's the first race of the season because there was a cheat code where you could put in Leclerc as your captain, Max as your driver, and Ferrari as your constructor, and still pick 3 guys from different teams.
Yeah, now, Ferrari was just grossly mispriced.
Yes, and I think, so was Magnussen.
Yep.
So was Bottas. Yep. Like they probably should have been ahead of the prices for the Haas cars and the Alfa Romeos should have been flipped with McLaren and Aston Martin. There's no way to know that the Alfa Romeos did not do well at all in testing and really in practice. And then Bottas was really good in qualifying, but that's kind of been the story his whole career.
Yep.
Their performance was surprising. We saw some of inklings that maybe Haas was going to be good. So you were able to put together a lineup that would have been optimal if Verstappen had finished second, where you could have had all of your drivers you wouldn't have had to stack anybody from an individual team.
Yeah.
You would have had 2 drivers from the same team.
Right. And I think that's why going into, and I'll talk about salary and ownership together here, because I think we did do like in what we thought was some pretty intense research on what was available to us. It seemed like those values, the Magnuson, the Bottas, even like Albon, because he was driving so much better than Latifi. Like they seemed like obvious cheap plays. It seemed obvious that you wanted to get some combo of Ferrari and Red Bull, especially after we saw qualifying. We saw Bottas finish sixth and Mercedes just be so much slower than the other two. But it's a new sport. We had data on the drivers. We have data on their practices. We have no data on how the field is going to react to these things if they're going to value it properly. So that lineup build to us seemed relatively obvious. We wanted to target those low salary players with a high grid position, which is where I think us value will come from all season, because salaries are going to come out before qualifying, which is that's where a lot of value is going to come from. The only thing that I really thought of outside of individual salary was, can you make some lineups where you're leaving a lot of salary on the table in hopes of not having a duplicated lineup? There just really wasn't a way to do it this week with, if you were playing Ferrari and Red Bull, you just couldn't really leave more than $1,500 on the table, which I think is going to be the case for the most part. And then from ownership, it was really a guessing game. You don't know what the hell people are going to do if they're going to value it properly. So I came up with like a loose ownership projection just that we used internally that basically was just solving the math problem. It wasn't super accurate, but that like how we tiered it out, it kind of did play out. So is there anything, before we get into what actually showed up in winning lineups, anything else that like that stood out to you in our initial research, before we had the results?
Not really. I mean, I think we were kind of spot on with where we were. And I mean, I think just kind of going forward, you're going to see the Ferrari prices from last week and the Mercedes prices from last week flipped. Yeah. I think Red Bull will probably be, or you might see actually, because I think Mercedes might have still been the number one constructor. They were still the most expensive constructor.
Mercedes was the most expensive. Yeah, Lewis was the most expensive.
Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, I think you're going to see Ferrari and Mercedes flip, and then that's going to create some headaches going forward trying to build a lineup.
Yeah.
But it just kind of ended up being a thing that you couldn't project. Like if you think that like a Williams car might break down during the race, like that's a reasonable thing to expect. To see both Red Bulls suffer power issues in the first race wasn't something that you could expect. So I think it kind of went the way we would have expected it to go. And now it's going to be interesting to see how they adjust. Just generally a question real quick for you. And I know this is a new sport and I don't know, like comparatively to NFL, like when do you think the prices will come out week to week for the next race?
Yeah, I don't know. So we're recording this Monday afternoon. They posted the race, the contest almost immediately. There's only 2 contests in the lobby right now, but they don't have salaries up yet. NFL typically, if it's, everything wraps up on Sunday, they typically had NFL salaries up by Monday afternoon. But we have so much information early in the week that isn't going to necessarily change, that you can still get pretty sharp pricing. And over the last 2 years, one thing DraftKings has done really well, at least in NFL, that's the only sport I play, they have priced very sharply. So it has been a really big struggle to build good lineups. I don't know how late they will wait in the week. I can't imagine that they will wait until after qualifying to release salaries. That just doesn't give people a lot of time. Maybe they will. If they do, that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
It's a brand new sport. I'm guessing the reason salaries aren't out right now is because they're probably tweaking the algorithm a little bit. There's probably just some stuff that they don't have automated in there. Like I said, as far as I know, the scoring does not mirror NASCAR scoring, so they're probably changing a lot of stuff by hand as we speak. So when are salaries going to drop? I don't know. I think, I think it would be really fun if they drop like Thursday or Friday, and then we get to see those values come out of qualifying. But that might also make it easier for the inexperienced players. I can't imagine, just knowing how DraftKings works, how they like to have their contests filled. I think not having salaries before qualifying might discourage people to sign up for the contests.
Yeah.
So I would think at least all season, especially because they started it this way in week one. The fact that it came out before qualifying, I just haven't seen DraftKings, mid-season for a sport make a change to they were do it after. But who knows? I mean, we could be completely wrong. But I would think they'll start coming up by like Wednesday or Thursday. We'll see though.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you're also going to have to be really diligent and like start kind of planning some things out, because you're going to know the salaries and you're going to have some projections, and then qualifying, like the number's not going to exactly be because like in the NFL, injuries are really the only like real variable that you get week to week over someone's pricing. I would say, like, with the pricing coming out, like with so much unknown until Saturday with Formula One, there might still even be just a couple of inefficiencies here and there, just based on you don't know how the cars are going to qualify.
Yeah, no, I think there'll be huge inefficiencies because, teams they'll be surprised, good and bad qualifying almost every week, which will give us some great DFS opportunities. When those happen, that's where, the free running back in NFL, the $4,000 running back, that's where we have to make these huge ownership decisions. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we think will change and what should stay the same a little bit at the end. Let's kind of talk about the results that we saw from the race. I'll go through a couple quick data points that I noticed from there was one big contest on DraftKings. It was the $150,000 guarantee. There was a little under 12,000 entries. It was a $15 buy-in, 150 max. So that was the biggest contest they offered. So I looked at all the top 1% teams, the best finish. There was a ton of dupes, unfortunately. Again, we'll get to what I think could, and we'll solve that soon. But similar to what we thought, and this has a lot to do with, when I think all season, assuming salaries don't go crazy, if the top teams win, we're going to see this result a lot. And don't take these data points, as gospel. Take them with a grain of salt. So much is going to change after we have more data points on what this data looks like. But let's just go over it quickly. We saw 93% of top 1% teams stack their captain with their constructor. That's what we thought was going to happen. 85% of teams only had one stack, and that was usually, again, the captain and constructor. Only 12% of top 1% teams had two teammates in the same lineup. Again, losing that 5 points for the team win is going to be pretty expensive. We saw the chalk hit very heavy on Ferrari with those expensive constructor captain stacks. If Max and Sergio finish the race, it's only going to exacerbate that number. We would have seen even probably, it might have been 99% of top 1% teams finish with expensive captain constructor. Only 3 lineups in the top 1% to the top 120 out of, almost 12K lineups paid down at the captain. 3 out of 120. It just there wasn't enough upside if you're paying down. You really needed those winner points at your multiplier position to be able to top the field. And luckily I was in that top of the field in one of those, but it didn't have, we'll get to what first place did. Any reaction to the stacks that we thought were going to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it kind of makes all the sense in the world with how it paid out and how it played out. I think we ultimately settled on what was going to be the best lineup. And again, the pre-Verstappen car failure was, I don't think we cracked any kind of secret code. I think we discovered an inefficiency in the way that there was pricing, and there were certain, like Magnussen had been doing better than Schumacher, although that one was a little bit dicier because Schumacher had done okay, but Bottas against a rookie teammate in his first race seemed pretty easy. And then there was one other that I'm just completely blanking on right now that seemed in that lower.
Was it Albon? Was it Albon?
Yes, Alex Albon.
Yeah.
Like the Latifi, nice kid, like just doesn't seem like he's ever going to be more than like an 18, 19, 20th place driver on any given week. And, Albon's had his ups and downs, but like was a pretty decent driver when he was with Red Bull. So those 3 guys were priced reasonably that you could do certain stacks. So it's not like we cracked any kind of certain code with it. Like, I
Yep.
don't think we discovered anything that a lot of other people couldn't if they didn't think it through. And that's where it's going to be interesting to see like what adjustments they make.
Yep.
Now, as someone who would like to be able to win and like their life to be easier, I hope they don't fix some of these inefficiencies. But I
Sure.
think if they really want to make it really challenging, I think you have to really penalize someone for stacking captain and constructor of the top teams.
Yeah, and we'll have quite a few ideas on that when we close out, because I think I have a few ideas, and again, I think DraftKings is usually pretty good about making these adjustments. You mentioned those cheap drivers and Max and Leclerc. So as it played out, I don't know if it's surprising because it did seem so obvious to us, and we don't have like a huge F1 background, but the field did a pretty good job of understanding how at least this first race with the salaries coming out a week early should be structured. So we saw Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc combined for 60% of the captain spots, which is huge. You know, that number can only add up to 100%. So they were both also in over 60% of lineups overall. Leclerc was in over 70% of lineups. We saw Ferrari and Red Bull. They combined for 84% of the constructor ownership, which is a insane number. Ferrari was massively underpriced, so that actually makes sense. Having those guys be so popular really forced lineups to have a high-low or stars and scrubs approach. So we saw Valtteri Bottas was over 60% ownership. We saw Albon have over 25%. Both of the Haas guys had really high ownership. So they were what we thought was going to be obvious was obvious. So that's a good thing in terms of like if you're new to the sport and these inefficiencies stay at least for a couple weeks. It should be relatively easy to get in there, build a competitive lineup. But if it's easy for everybody, it's going to be hard to gain an edge on the field. I think there definitely will be some edges. I mean, we saw almost 12% of lineups rostered Lando at like almost $9,000, which was just like, even if you get 5 points from him and he beats Ricardo, paying that much for just the 5 was just it was just there. They were priced where McLaren was just such an easy phase. So, you know, if 15% of the field is making those type of errors, we're going to still have edges. But ownership was, I think, as sharp as that could have been for a first ever sport, first ever DFS. Any reaction to ownership?
I mean, it all makes sense. And again, I think the Norris thing was people on the right track, but not thinking it through entirely. Yep. It's like if you knew what we knew going in and that Ricardo had COVID and hadn't really had a chance to drive this car on this track yet, it seemed like Norris would have been a pretty easy shoe-in to beat him. And then obviously we talked about earlier that didn't happen. So I get it, but you just come down to like the financial value of it. And like you said, like that's probably where people assume, that's probably where who like less sharp followers of the sport probably were like, oh, McLaren's been good. Maybe they saw something about Ricardo not being quite up to par yet, and they made those decisions. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think everything else really made sense. And like we talked about it, this kind of seemed like the code was easily crackable this week, and I'm sure that'll change. And I think, I think the thing in my respect that I kind of overthought this race was new car, first race with the new car. Will there be a little bit more kind of chaos than normal? And it didn't end up being the case at all. And this is just not a track where there's a lot of, even when there was more overtaking, it's not a track where you see guys wreck. It is one of the safest tracks on course. So like sticking to your plan was always the way to go here. And, it ends up being a bad beat when you end up with what seems to be the right path, and the Red Bulls end up not performing. And the other thing that just kind of comes back in my head that I was thinking about that I did want to mention, and I'm probably going to do a little bit of research on this week, is what Bottas's average qualifying position was when he was at Mercedes. Yeah. Because the best lineups had Russell in them this week. Yeah. And that's because Russell started 9th and finished 4th. So
that's a perfect segue to I think one thing that I mean, again, it's it's the first time we've ever had DFS, so there's going to be some blind spots. There's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. To your point, like it could end up being a good thing that this race played out so predictably and the chalk hit, because it could just really cause people to not factor in some of the variance that is going to be coming up at some of these more dangerous tracks, or when weather gets involved. But one thing with piggybacking off what you just said about George Russell was in the winning lineup. So we were right in that you should be chasing those teammates beats drivers, because if I think you're going to need to, for the most part, sweep that, or at least have 4 drivers. So those top 1% teams in that big tournament, on average, they had 4.1 drivers in the top 10, so 4 out of 5. On average, they had 4.4 drivers beat their teammates. So they usually accrued 25 points of beating their teammate, which is a lot. That's 20% of the winning score. I think the winning score is 173. The very interesting thing is that the winning lineup, which was duped, it had George Russell and Esteban Ocon over the Lewis Hamilton Alexander Albon combination. Even though George Russell didn't beat Lewis Hamilton and didn't get the +5, having him and Ocon in the top 10 was more valuable, even though Ocon was more expensive than Albon. That combination with the top 10 points, with Russell finishing points, I think it's 18 for 4th place. That's more valuable than just getting Albon's cheap +5 and getting Hamilton's podium. So that's a really interesting nuance to think about, that you might not have to sweep your drivers beating their teammates, but if you give that up, you need to be chasing top 10s. Like, you need to be going with like a middling salary. And we talked about this right after the race. We think these opportunities are going to come from the second driver on good teams. They can be really good candidates to pay middle tier salary instead of going for like a high-low strategy. So this week's example was paying up for Lewis Hamilton, playing down for Alexander Albon. That was a very popular combination. Instead, Russell and Esteban at mid salaries was actually a better combo, because they both got you top 10s and Russell got that 4th place points. So that's something really interesting to think about moving forward, like a very interesting lineup building nuance that I think I didn't think about before, and I'm glad I saw it in week 1.
Yeah, but then again, like you talk about, like, are you going to see more results like this? Because
right.
Like Russell, I think Russell ends up with 16 points if my math's right,
Okay.
12 for 4th place, 1 for finishing as a classified driver, and then 3 points for a 5-place grid position improvement.
Yep.
So that gets him to 16. Where if he finishes 6th, that's 8 and 1, and then 2. So he gets an extra 5 points, basically, because of what happened at the end of that race, and that that's the 5 points that you get for a driver who finishes outside the points but beats their teammate.
Yep. And I think it'll be, again, it's not like we're not going to have any hard and fast rules, especially this early. I think it'll be an interesting thing to think about when we're making like that last combo decision. The candidates for this are going to be like, if Sergio Perez qualifies 9th or something like that, that's when you're really going to have that decision. If Sergio qualifies 3rd, Max qualifies 1st, like Sergio just doesn't have enough upside in terms of moving up the grid to get those 5 points. So that will be the spot where I think it'll be really fun, and we'll talk about that a lot on the Saturday pods when we discuss strategy, but something to think about. Before we kind of get out of here with our thoughts on what should and shouldn't change, did anything stand out to you from a betting thing? I know you said there wasn't a ton of action that you were looking for, but just did anything stand out, whether it be bets that were available, like variance between the sports books, or just anything that you're going to change going into next week?
Not really. Like, obviously, if you really bought into the Ferrari hype early, there was a lot of money to be made. I don't know what his price to win the race this weekend was. I know Leclerc was like +500 or +550 or 5-1 or 5.5-1 early in the week before practice and qualifying. I know that as of February, like late February, he was 10-1 to win the championship, and now he's the favorite.
Yeah.
So it's going to be one of those things. You brought it up very briefly earlier, and it's just going to be one of those things where it's like setting aside some kind of stack to just bet on Lewis Hamilton until he ends up back to where he should be, and he's even money, or I don't know if there's going to ever be minus money. Like, that's the fun thing this year is like, you're probably going to be able, if and when Mercedes gets back to where they should be, you're now going to potentially have 3 drivers and maybe 4, because, Carlos, everyone loves Leclerc, and I like Charles Leclerc a lot, but like Carlos Sainz beat him out last year. He had more points than Leclerc. Now, the caveat to that being when they both finished in the points last year, Leclerc beat him 12-3. So typically when Sainz beat him, it was because Leclerc didn't race well. But
Sure.
both guys are good drivers. They're in good cars. So maybe there's 4 guys in any given week that can compete at that level. I would like to see, I think like driver matchups are where I want to see these markets go, because it just doesn't feel like offhand that a lot of these markets are going to be really easy to make money, because the guys, so you can pick like podium finish, like the typical things you're going to find are like driver to finish on the podium, driver to finish in the top 6, driver to finish in the points. Like you might see, well, both of these cars finished. Like I wish I knew the price on Alfa Romeo to double points this weekend, because you probably could have made money there. I don't know why anybody in their right mind ever would have even bet that. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. But like Red Bull to both in the points, you're going to be paying a lot of juice on that, because there's no value whatsoever, because those cars are supposed to do that. So to me, it's going to be really hard for the books to expand their offerings, because it's they just don't have as much information, and they probably just don't have, I just don't know how much of a, at least in the United States, I just still don't know how blossoming that market is compared to everything else. I think it's good for them that by and large a lot of the season takes place when football is not going on.
Right.
But I think, like you talked about it with DFS, I think it's going to be the same thing with golf. I think once football season ends, I think you're going to see a lot of the sharp bettors and DFS players going over to golf. So I don't know that Formula One is going to ever really have that huge market. So I would like to see more offerings and more fun things out there to bet. But I think the American books at least are going to take it kind of slow. You can find, like, looking at the odds for this week, FanDuel's got some like sharper prices by a couple of cents than DraftKings right now. BetMGM actually had Verstappen and Leclerc co-favorites, and you can get Leclerc at plus 140 at BetMGM right now, and it's not quite as good odds elsewhere. So if you're buying the Ferrari hype, like I would head over there, and as it is with anything, like I tend to just kind of to stick with a couple of the legal ones that I just always bet. But if you really want to beat these games, we got to price shop. You got to go see where you can find the value, and some books are going to have better odds than others. But generally speaking, it's you're not going to find a ton of variance. It's going to be a few cents here and there, but like over the course of the season, that will add up.
Yeah, and again, I don't have a U.S. facing betting in California yet, but I mean, we're in the chat and we're talking, and I think early week is really important for Formula One. Last week we saw, I think at one point Max got all the way up to plus 185. He qualified second, and still the closing line had him at plus 115 as the favorite. So you're going to get that's how I think you're going to get most of your value in betting, is betting early in the week. If you're betting after qualifying, you're lose. There's not going to be any value anywhere. Obviously, it'll be here and there, but the big value is gonna dry up really, really fast on there. Looking just at the state of, and this is probably going to be mostly DFS because that's what can change the most. What do you think can or should change going forward?
They've got to get the pricing right. I think like we talked about it a little bit earlier, I really truly believe to add some variance to this and to make it really challenging, you have to basically put people to a decision over, like, are you going to take Charles Leclerc or are you going to take Ferrari? Because you can't just keep it that way. Or even so, like, you have to kind of steepen the prices. And another thing we didn't really talk about is, like, the constructor is super important. Like, more important than getting the captain right, because Ferrari had 61 points, I think, yesterday. And I think
61.
I think Mercedes was like 30 something. Like, that's a huge edge there. So they're going to have to kind of figure things out to the point where you can't just look at it and say, oh, well, if I take the 2 guys who are going to finish first and one of the constructors that should finish first or second, and then 3 guys that are just going to beat their teammates. Like, basically, for them to make it that way, they have to set it up to a point where they have to get the pricing to the point where if you're going to take Leclerc and Verstappen and one of their constructors, you're going to have to take Nicholas Latifi.
Yeah, I think that is the most obvious change that we need, and hopefully DraftKings will change. I think the salary floor is too low, and the salary ceiling was too low. It was just too easy to get those guys. Now, the one thing that I know that they'll adjust is properly pricing the middle, like the Alfa Romeos, the Haas. They're going to be properly priced, which is going to make decisions much harder than they were this week. If they really they really need to raise the ceiling price of those top teams. I will say that if and I'm going to say when because I do think they will. Mercedes gets it together. That is going to help because when you have three constructors and three drivers instead of two, you're going to have to leave one out, right? So the decisions will get harder. And having the floor teams actually be the worst drivers will help. So I think that will help with the dupe problem we saw in week one. It was rampant, and I wasn't surprised. I think we're going to have to work really hard on thinking through things, on taking some big risks to be unique, even when they do change those things. But we don't like. I would just say we're going to see a lot change in terms of what actually wins, whether it be lineup construction or how many points are scored. Like, don't take the first race as that is how you need to build a winning lineup. It's rare to see a team finish 1-2, and that's why we saw so many constructor points. Like, Max and Sergio aren't going to both miss the races every single week. Max was challenging for the lead at the end of that race. They were going back and forth before he started losing power. If Lewis gets in the mix, you're going to see a lot of mixed podiums with three different teams up there. There's going to be incidents when we get to these harder, not harder, but more higher incident tracks. When weather starts playing a factor, these things are going to mix it up. Like the chalk, even with Red Bull not finishing, the chalk still just hit at such a high clip this week. So I would say that all these little data points and track nuances are really going to change how we should be building, and we should just take this first week as a learning experience, but also as something that we're really trying to build on, because again, these are brand new cars that have never been driven in races. It's been one race. Not going to be a lot of shakeup at the top. There could still be a lot of shakeup in who's the fourth best team and who's the sixth best team right now, which can really, change things over how we're perceiving salaries and whatnot. So I would just say, stay tuned to that. What do you think is a takeaway from week one that we can rely on? Maybe not week in and week out, but that seems like something that you're going to be paying attention to all season.
I mean, I think that I don't think Ferrari was a 1 week wonder. I think Mercedes will catch up, but I do think that they're going to be good all year, and that's going to make things interesting. I do think we're going to need a few more weeks to kind of see how everything else after those top three teams shakes out. But to me, I think that we now have a third team that you have, and they're the dominant one for now, and that may not stay that way, but they're a team that you're going to have to kind of factor in. I think Williams is Williams. It's the top and the bottom. Like Ferrari looks like they're legit. Williams looks like it's going to be really tough to justify playing those guys. Even Albon, there might be some value at some point, but I think you're going to get to a point where you're going to be put to the test, or you might have to play Latifi, and even that is not necessary. Like those cars are just not good. There's just such a thing where that it's just like the cars could go badly on the track. They could have a bad weekend because it's just a constructor that has struggled. I think the other thing is I think we'll see more exciting races, but I just would say to not underestimate the quality of these drivers.
Yeah.
And even though that they are more capable of passing, I don't know that you're going to see necessarily chaos like we've seen in NASCAR so far this season in a lot of these races. They're still really good drivers. So I don't think, with a few exceptions, this weekend, it's going to be interesting because the race, it's the new track in Saudi Arabia last year. The race was a bit of a mess. They've made some changes there. And we've got a couple of new tracks this year. So maybe you'll see some things, but by and large, man, these guys are so good at what they do that I think really banking on chaos isn't something that I would expect, even as we're kind of seeing a little bit uncertainty with where we are. And this weekend, I think you might see a little bit different. You're going to see a different kind of race than we saw this weekend because it's a completely different kind of style of track, and it's a lot more dangerous. And but still, it's probably going to be the same guys who are in the same spot, and it's going to be kind of trying to find that value once those prices come out.
Yeah, and if it does end up being a 3-team race, one thing that we saw last season was that Max was super aggressive with Lewis, and Lewis was aggressive with Max, but he downplays it like he's not. But they could afford to do that to each other because if they collided, no one's behind them, no one's catching them anyway. So they were able to be super aggressive with each other. If it's a 3-team race and Ferrari's definitely gonna be in the mix, but if Mercedes gets back in the mix, you're not going to be able to push out whatever driver you're battling with, because if Max pushes Leclerc and then all of a sudden Lewis gets all the points, that's super detrimental to the team. So they're going to not if it's not a 2-man or a 2-team race, they're going to have to be a little more cautious because whoever's behind them is going to be able to gain a ton of ground. So they're really going to have to be careful with that this year. So that'll be interesting.
That's a really good point. And you think about you end up with, I got to bring up the standings again. You bring up with Hamilton getting 15 and Russell getting 12. So 27 points for Mercedes and none for Red Bull.
Yeah.
Is an absolute disaster for Red Bull, just in the grand scheme of racing, not DFS or betting or anything like that. And that's a really good point. Red Bull's got to get some results. Yeah. Now, that's not going to stop. Max Verstappen's a lunatic, so it's not going to stop him necessarily. But it's going to be interesting to see in some of these races. Do you really go for it? Do you kind of manage? Do you pull back? Because Verstappen, and it's that's the other element of this that we don't know is Lewis Hamilton is the greatest driver of all time, maybe. Yep. Verstappen just won a championship. Charles Leclerc's never been close.
Yeah.
So what happens to him as the season progresses and he's in a clear title fight? Does he have the nerve to not make the mistakes? And then if he finishes if he gets the pole in one race in a race, but then doesn't make, and then he makes a mistake at some point, you now have 2 teams chasing him down. It's a fascinating thing to think with 3 teams now instead of the 2. Then it's going to it all has a trickle down effect to your strategy for all of this stuff. But you're still probably at the end of the day, your best bet is probably going to be having those teams and those guys heavily featured in your lineups and then trying to find the value elsewhere.
Yeah. It's going to be really fun to see. I think over the first 5, after 4 or 5 races, we'll have a really good idea. But I think these next 3 or 4 weeks, it's going to be really exciting because I think people are still going to make some really big errors because it is such a new sport, and so many things I think will change over the next few races. So it's going to be really fun to keep coming up and formulating our strategy with the world. If you haven't started playing with yet, you're not behind the 8 ball because nobody has ever played more than one day of F1 DFS. So if you're interested, there's no better time to get into a newer sport. We're going to, hopefully we're going to do these all the time. Outside of myself and Dan, we also have Jennifer Akins, who runs the redraft side of things over at 4for4, and Sam Hoppin, who helps with some of our data viz stuff for both BetSperts and 4for4. They're going to be rotating in, hosting these pods. So Mondays after the races, we'll be doing recaps like this one. Saturday, after qualifying, any 2 of the 4 we just mentioned, we'll be doing strategy shows. And this one, this was really long because we gave you guys a 25-minute intro getting into everything. Going forward, hopefully we'll keep these in the 30 to 40-minute range, super quick and digestible. So I'm looking forward to it. And if anybody's listening and interested in some those DFS data points, ownership and stuff, I'll be tracking those all year, so I'll probably start tweeting them out a bit once we have a few more data points. So stay tuned. It's going to be really fun. Check out the 4for4 betting plan, get access to all of our content and tools. Obviously a ton going on with NFL, whether it be getting into best ball, getting some of those bets for college basketball, for golf, for NFL draft futures. We got all of that going on over at 4for4. Keep an eye out. BetSperts Golf. Masters is coming up in a couple of weeks. There's a really big launch coming up with BetSperts over there. And keep an eye out for the BetSperts bundle. We got something in the works where we're going to be able to get you access to all of the BetSperts property for one price. So not going to give all the details on that, but just keep an eye out because I think people are going to be really, really happy With that, make sure you're following us. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. BetSperts Golf is at BetSperts Golf. Dan is at really Dan Weiner. I'm at TJ Hernandez. Talk to you guys on Saturday.